Hello and welcome to CEO Report Television. I'm your host, Steve Lubatkin. We hear from many people that employees are our greatest asset. Well, our guest today on CEO Report Television has come up with a way of measuring the value of those assets, those employees. His name is Dave Bookbinder. Dave is a director in the Financial Advisory Services Group at EisnerAmper, and he's the author of a new book, The New ROI, Return on Individuals. With more than 25 years of experience, Dave has a diverse background in corporate finance consulting. He has particular expertise in the areas of business valuation and intellectual property valuation. He's conducted valuations of the securities and intangible assets of public and private corporations for all sorts of things like acquisitions and divestitures, fairness opinions, reorganizations, solvency opinions, recapitalizations, estate planning, and regulatory compliance. Dave was also recognized by CEO Report's predecessor, Smart CEO magazine, with an award for executive management. He's also the recipient of the Morris Groner Award for entrepreneurship. Dave also contributes to the business section of the Huffington Post. Dave Bookbinder is the author of The New ROI, Return on Individuals, and I'm glad to have Dave here at the table today.
Thanks, it's my pleasure to be here.
Dave, explain a little bit about how you came up with this concept of return on individuals and why is it important for people who are trying to put together a high-performance, successful team?
Sure. So as a valuation professional, I spent my entire career helping companies figure out what their business is and what their intellectual property is worth. One of those intangible or intellectual property assets is human capital. About 2 years ago, I wrote an article entitled The New ROI, Return on Individuals. Never intended to write a book, frankly. I wrote this one article that talked about how we in the valuation community value people. I've always believed that people really are a company's most valuable asset, but unfortunately, in the quantitative world that I live in most of the time, it doesn't actually work out that way mathematically. So I wrote this article, and then people started to show up in my life and telling me that this is something much bigger than one article. It turned into a series. I wound up collaborating with more than 20 thought leaders from across North America, each with a different perspective on human capital and how people contribute to the value of a business. And then that wound up becoming a book and an online community on LinkedIn and Facebook. So with the premise that people really are a company's most valuable asset, the way I would summarize it succinctly in marrying kind of the human capital component with the valuation component is this. The value of a business at the end of the day is a function of how well the financial capital and the intellectual capital are managed by the human capital. So you better get the human capital part right.
So what are the key things that people should be looking for when they're trying to get that human capital right?
Yeah, so it's a number of things. It starts with recruitment and selection of employees, and there's some scientific ways that you can use workforce analytics to determine the right fit employees and best fit. We've got a chapter in the book that discusses that. Nuanced things like employee engagement. You probably have seen the Gallup poll surveys, and typically every year it indicates that roughly 1/3 of a workforce in the U.S. is actually engaged. So think about that. So if your business is a lifeboat, for example, and you've got 10 people on that lifeboat, you've got 3 in the front who are rowing enthusiastically towards their destination and their goal. You've got 4 in the middle that are kind of looking at the icebergs, and there's 3 in the back who are trying to sink you. So engagement's important. Teaming, alignment of brand and culture, things like that contribute to the value of an enterprise and the value of your workforce.
Are there ways to identify how people fit into certain jobs and how to put the best person in the best job?
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot of science behind that, and a couple of my collaborating partners are expert in those fields. One, a fellow by the name of Dave Nast, who uses a tool called the predictive index. And it's a scientific way of actually analyzing the right fit person for a right fit role. And if you think about it, he's written a piece that's something to the effect of mapping the corporate genome, where if you have a group of selected high performers that you've identified that meet your criteria as high performers, you can kind of map their genome, if you will, and match it against an assessment that he'll provide so you can find employees that fit that exact profile. That's one example. Dr. Janice Presser is the head of the Gabriel Institute here in the Philadelphia area.
I actually know Janet.
Yeah,
we've crossed paths in networking groups and things.
Great, yeah. So she's wonderful, real fireball, and she's got a group of professionals that are working with her around teamability.
Sure.
And when you think about what makes a great team, it's a lot more than just taking people together and putting them at a table and saying, now go play nice with one another. So Dr. Janice has that all figured out.
Now, a lot of companies take people to offsite meetings and engage in what they call team building exercises. Does that have value, or are there better ways to get people to gel as a team?
So I think anything that you can do to get teams together is a good thing. And I've been on many of team building exercises. Employees get to know one another, and they can build a rapport and build trust that's so important within the organization. But I think the real key to any of these offsites or any other employee type gathering is the intention that leadership has when they do it. If leadership is just going through the motions and they're putting people together because they think they have to, and the focus really isn't about trying to achieve the building of trust, it's not going to work, and the employees will see through that. So it really starts at the top.
What are some of the kinds of employees that you see as you're evaluating people? Are there specific types that you can classify people into, or is there some way to categorize people into groups?
Yeah, so in my world as the valuation person, we aggregate teams into the assembled workforce, and then we can sort of identify rock stars. The challenge that we have is I identify a rock star employee in the valuation community. That rock star employee is only a, quote, rock star if they're encumbered by a non-competition agreement. And I'm of the view that you don't have to necessarily be encumbered by a non-compete to be a rock star. Rock stars exist everywhere in an organization. It's a function of their mindset and being a leader within the organization.
Talk a little bit more about that. How does a non-compete factor into whether or not a person's a rock star?
Yeah, so again, that's one of the handcuffs that I have in valuing human capital from the valuation perspective, right? So it's more about the contract that is a non-compete. By inference, it's the person that's encumbered by that non-compete that is perceived to be the rock star. So if an employee is, quote, valuable, meaning that they could impact sales, they could impact customers if they were to leave, so they have that non-competition agreement, they're considered to be somebody that's valued in a valuation context. But like I said before, I think that there are rock stars within organizations that aren't encumbered by non-competes. They may not touch customer relationships, but they add a ton of value, and without them, the organization would suffer.
Are there any situations that you've experienced where you did all this work on the return on the individual and it ended up not being a match? And what did you take away from that experience?
Yeah, so I think it's important to understand that right now people and human capital don't appear anywhere in a financial statement. That's a different subject for another day. But in my world, human capital gets valued and winds up being subsumed into goodwill. Okay? The premise of the book is, again, that people are a company's most valuable asset, and it's really the impact that the people have on the value of the business enterprise.
And what are some of the ways that you can help people advance the value of the enterprise?
Yeah, so anything that really helps to foster engagement, anything that helps to foster trust, those are two key components. Obviously, you want to increase retention, right? Because there's real costs for losing employees when you have turnover. And most people, I think, understand what those direct costs are, but oftentimes lost in those costs are the softer costs, the indirect costs, the impact on morale, the impact on engagement, what happens to the folks who are still left behind.
Mm-hmm. Now, human capital in the way you describe return on individuals in the book doesn't appear on financial statements, but you are looking at ways that you could enhance your valuation capabilities, as I understand it, by adding this look at the people into the, maybe not the financial equation, but the overall equation. Talk a little bit about how you think that might work.
Yeah, so I think every CEO on the planet has said people are this company's most valuable asset. They don't always know how to quantify that, or really what that means in the big picture. And what I try to explain here in the book, that people really are the company's most valuable asset, and we explore different ways that you might think about it. Present different ideas on how you might think about valuing people in the aggregate, how to identify some of those rock star employees that we talked about. But bigger picture, there's been empirical evidence that's been demonstrated that companies that actually invest in their people in a variety of different ways outperform their peers. There have been stock portfolios that have been put together based upon investments in people. Those portfolios have outperformed the indexes. And I believe there's a convergence that's happening. The SEC is currently being petitioned by a huge investor group asking for mandatory disclosures around human capital investment for public registrants. So just think about that for a second. If you're looking to invest in a business, do you want to invest in a company where senior leadership turns over, every 3 years? Probably not. So those are good kinds of disclosures. And just weaving in the valuation wonky sort of stuff, there's a belief that if you're investing your capital efficiently around companies that invest in people, you're going to enjoy a lower cost of capital, which should increase the overall value of your business.
There are any number of surveys or ratings or rankings of companies that are regarded as the best places to work. How useful are those rankings in indicating the satisfaction level of the people who work there, but also whether it's meaningful to the company's success?
I think it is meaningful. In terms of employees' disclosure about their particular engagement, if they feel comfortable that the surveys are anonymous, I think they're more inclined to be candid. But that said, there is empirical data out there that evidences that those companies that are classified as great places to work generally do outperform their peers. So I think it's important.
What are some of the things that you see that are really good practices for executives to be successful and to manage successfully?
It starts with being intentional about it. It has to be more than just a great idea. It can't just be the HR responsibility. It's got to start at the top, and it's got to be infused into the DNA of the organization.
Some examples? Do you have any?
Yeah, sure. There's a local company that's actually a case study in the book, MHS Lift. Their CEO, Andy Levin, took over and became intentional about corporate culture. And he instilled something that they call the fundamentals. And every employee carries a little handout with 26 fundamentals that are the core values of the company. And they handle every situation, whether it's internal or client-facing, based on those fundamentals. So it really is in the DNA of the firm. And what he's experienced as a result of being intentional about corporate culture is they've had improvements in sales, improvements in profitability, improvements in safety, and they've won awards.
What's the one takeaway you want to leave with CEOs about the return on individuals, the value of thinking about your people as an important, truly important asset? You've talked about it pretty clearly, but maybe some people are not convinced.
Yeah, the key takeaway is it's not just hokum. When I started out on this journey and started to collaborate with these other thought leaders, what I've learned is that there's real data to support the fact that if you are investing in your people, they really truly are your most valuable asset, and you will reap the benefit of the returns in terms of the valuation of your enterprise.
Are there any things that you've learned since you've started this journey that you wish you knew earlier?
I think the biggest aha for me, Steve, was the fact that the message had so much resonance. I mean, I believed it to my core, but I was really surprised and amazed by the outpouring that I've received as a result of putting this out there and the building of the community that we have.
And once again, the places where people can find the community.
So there's a community on LinkedIn. So if you search for the new ROI, Return on Individuals, you'll find a LinkedIn group, and I would encourage your viewers to sign up for that. We're also on Facebook. And then I've got a social media presence on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter. And you can also find me at our company website, eisneramper.com.
Great. Dave, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Pleasure.